For every mystery there is someone, somewhere, who knows the truth. Perhaps that someone is watching. Perhaps it's you. Join me.
The mystery of the Villisca Axe Murders. There are some true crime mysteries that keep people up at night. The nagging questions, the great big whodunit. On June 10, 1912, one of these mysterious murders took place and, despite having a good idea what may have happened, there are still questions about exactly who committed the Villisca Axe Murders. On June 10, 1912, 10-year-old Mary Catherine Moore invited friends in May, 8, and Lena Gertrude Stilliner, 12, to spend the night at her home in Villisca, Iowa. The fun day would begin with the Children's Day program at their church, which her mother Sarah, 39, had coordinated, and end with a fun sleepover for the three girls. The program ended and the Moores and the Stilliner sisters arrived at the Moores' home around 10 p.m. From there, sometime between when they arrived home and the following morning, a mysterious crime took place inside of the Moore home. One that leaves people theorizing still to this day. At around 7 a.m. the following morning, a woman named Mary Beckham, the Moore's neighbor, grew concerned when she did not see the Moore children performing their morning chores. It was very unlike them to get such a late start to the day, so she went to the house and knocked on the door. She received no answer. She tried to enter the home but found the door locked. So, Mary let the chickens out and called Josiah Moore's brother to come check on the family. He knocked and too received no answer, so, using his spare key, he entered the home and was greeted with a horrific sight. When he opened the guest room door, he found in and Lena's bodies and yelled for the neighbor to call Villisca's primary peach officer. As more of the house was searched, each member of the Moore family was found in their beds having been bludgeoned to death with Josiah's own axe. There was Josiah, 43, and his wife Sarah and their 4 children: Herman Montgomery, 11, Mary Catherine, Arthur Boyd, 7, and Paul Vernon, 5. Immediately, the people of Villisca were scratching their heads. The Moores were a well-liked, affluent family. As investigators began searching the house, they found 2 spent cigarettes in the attic, leaving them to believe that the killer, or killers, waited in the attic for the family to fall asleep. They began in Josiah and Sarah's home, and moved on from room to room while each were fast asleep. Except for Lena, who showed signs that she attempted to fight her assailant, her nightgown found pushed up on her waist and wearing no undergarments. Josiah received the worst of it, having so many cuts to his face that his eyes were missing. During his attack, the killer used the blade while, with the other members, the blunt end was used. The killer also left a 4-pound slab of bacon leaning against the wall next to the axe, and all of the mirrors and glass in the home was covered with pieces of clothing. On the table was a plate of uneaten food and a bowl of bloody water. No one knew anyone who would want to hurt them, let anyone kill them. The investigation began and every unaccounted-for stranger in the town became a suspect. The first was a man named Andy Sawyer. There was no real evidence that connected him to the crime, but his name did get brought up during the course of the investigation. According to a bridge foreman and pile driver, Andy approached the crew around 6 a.m. on the morning of the murders and asked for a job. His shoes and pants were covered in mud, but, needing the manpower, they gave Andy a job. Then, the crew started to notice that this man seemed to want to know everything about the Villisca Axe Murders. He purchased every newspaper and asked constantly if anyone knew if they had caught the murderer. That he had been in Villisca the night of the murder and didn't want to be a suspect, so he left. His boss turned him in on June 18, 1912. He would later testify that, just before the sheriff arrived, Andy suddenly jumped up and said to himself, "I will cut your goddamn heads off," and make striking motions like he was using an axe. Someone else testified that, one day when the crew went through Villisca, and he mentioned that he could show them how the murderer got out of town and proceeded to jump over a box and point towards the railroad track. He was eventually dismissed as a suspect when officials learned that he could prove he was in Iowa at the time of the murders. He was arrested that night and wasn't put on the train out of town until 11 p.m. Next to be considered was George Kelly, who was a traveling minister in town at the time of the murders. He was described as odd and had issues with peeping into windows and asking women to pose nude for him. He taught at the very Children's Day service that the Moore family attended and left town promptly the next morning, just hours before the bodies were found. He even confessed to the murders in court, and gave great detail about the crime to police prior to his arrest, but the jury did not believe his confession when he was tried twice for the murder. Another suspect was Frank Jones, a Iowa state senator who had business taken away by Josiah Moore, who was also rumored to be having an affair with Frank's daughter-in-law. Then, there was the serial killer theory. Some believed that a serial killer, operating along the railways, went from state to state committing similar axe murders. Murders like those that occurred in New Orleans. One of these suspected serial killers was William Mansfield, who also murdered his in-laws and child with an axe just 2 years before the Villisca murders, and was suspected of a second axe murder in Kansas just 4 days before the Moore murders. Another was Henry Lee Moore, who murdered his mother and grandmother just a few months before the ones in Villisca. And, finally, Paul Mueller, whose connection to the Villisca murders, as well as many others, were the subject of a 2017 book, The Man from the Train. The authors surmised that this axe murderer, who they believed was Paul Mueller, killed at least 59 people in 14 separate incidents along the railways. But, in the end, we are only left to make assumptions and accusations. No one, as of yet, has been definitively connected to the Villisca Axe murder.